Well, welcome to another Encounters, and we're looking at Jacob tonight. If I just get down to the right place, we're going to, before we read or go into the story of Jacob, we've got two passages of scripture to read. So is there anybody who'd like to read one of the two passages? Jean, would you do one? I thought before we wave.
Sorry?
Yeah, okay. I'll read the first one.
Genesis 28, 10 to 22. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you, and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I can return safely to my father's household. I've lost household. Then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And of all that you gave me, I will give you a tenth. Is that it?
That's it, thank you. Anyone like to read the second one? Slightly shorter. Hilary, do you want to?
Yep. So Genesis 32, 22 to 32. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with human beings and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose about him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon.
Thank you. So as I said, we're looking at Jacob tonight, one of the key men in the Old Testament. Now, his story is quite a long one, so we've just read a couple of times when he encountered God, and I'll fill in other parts as we go through. So the normal sort of question, so who was Jacob? Well, he was the second son of Isaac, Abraham's son, through whom God had promised to bless all the nations, and Rebekah. He had an elder brother, Esau. But before they were born, they were obviously already fighting, as brothers do. Because Genesis 25, 22 to 23 says, the babies jostled each other within her, and she said, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So as we'll see later in the story, Jacob was going to be the one God intended to use to carry out his plan even before the brothers were born. And this family feuding carried on, as Genesis 25:28 tells us. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And this family division led to Jacob, with Rebekah's help, actually deceiving Isaac to receive the blessing for the firstborn, cheating Esau out of it. Although on a previous occasion, he'd taken an oath to give it to Jacob in return for a meal when he returned home famished. So as you can see, things weren't particularly good in this family, and the feud was continuing. In fact, after Jacob had taken the blessing, Esau stated his intention to kill him when Isaac died. Esau also married Canaanite women, which caused distress to both Isaac and Rebekah. So Isaac sends Jacob to Rebekah's brother Laban in Paddan Aram, which is in the east, to find a wife from her family. So to cut the story short and get on to Jacob's encounter with God, he ends up serving Laban as a shepherd for 20 years. He gets 2 wives and 2 concubines and has 11 sons and a daughter before he returns to Canaan. Now, the relationship between his wives, although they were sisters, was also a bit of a struggle, a competition for Jacob's love. He'd always loved Rachel, and she was the one he wanted to marry. But Laban tricked him into marrying Leah, the older sister, first, so that Jacob would serve him longer. And the favoritism Jacob showed to Rachel and her sons would have consequences later on. But that is another story. So how did he encounter Jesus? Well, I'm concentrating on the 2 stories we read tonight. And in the first one, we heard about Jacob's first major encounter with God when he was leaving Canaan to go to the east. He has a dream, seeing a ladder going up to heaven, and God speaks to him. So that was a dream, and he heard God speak. In the second reading, however, we hear about a second major encounter when he actually wrestles with a man, God in human form, possibly Jesus, until daybreak. So what happened in these 2 encounters, and what effect did they have on Jacob? I'd say in the first one, he sees this ladder with angels ascending and descending on it, and then he sees God in heaven. God speaks to him and gives him some very significant promises. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. But when he wakes up, Jacob's first reaction to this is fear, because he has, at least in his dream, seen God, and thinks the place where he's lying is a sacred house of God, which is why he calls it Bethel, because that's what Bethel means, and is the gate to heaven. And that was a pretty common idea in religions at the time, of a stairway used by the messengers of the gods. Well, at the bottom of the staircase would be the temple of the deity, where offerings would be made to them. So what does Jacob do? He takes a stone he placed under his head and sets it up as a pillar, and pours oil on top of it symbolizing the dedication of it to God. Now, it would appear from the reading that Jacob hadn't been following God particularly well before this, as he makes a vow. If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Well, that doesn't sound like a very wholehearted commitment, as it starts out with an if and includes a then. This makes it conditional on God providing for and protecting him before he will accept him as his God. Or what he vowed was a gift to God if he kept his part of the covenant. However, it does show us something about how we should respond to God's provision. Jacob promises to give him a tithe of a tenth of everything he gets upon the fulfillment of the condition. Since income and personal wealth was often not primarily in money at the time, all goods were included in the calculations of that tithe. And it's likely that Jacob anticipated that any wealth coming to him would be in the form of flocks and herds. That was, again, normal at the time. Therefore, this gift he's offering would be represented in sacrifices offered to God at Bethel. Jacob's tithe, however, from the way it's expressed here, is clearly voluntary rather than to meet any legal requirement. We have to remember this is quite a long time before the law came into being with Moses, so there wasn't a legal requirement for that. And it also reflects Abraham's tithe of the tenth to Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God, in Genesis 14:20. And that was a thank offering to God for his success in rescuing Lot and others. So at this point, although it does seem to be a bit half-hearted, Jacob recognizes everything comes from God and wants to give him thanks and praise of his own free will, not because it's a requirement or a duty. Fast forward 20 years, and the second major encounter is on his way back to Canaan. He has heard from God in the meantime. Genesis 31:3 tells us that God actually said to him, "Go back to the land of your fathers and your relatives, and I will be with you." He obeys God, but not in a particularly honourable way. He tries to leave without telling Laban, and that creates another bad situation, with Laban pursuing him with all his men. Luckily for Jacob, God intervenes, and he warns Laban off in a dream, telling him, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. So when Laban does overtake him, they meet up and they come to an agreement. Laban then goes back to his home country, and Jacob and his household move on and get to the border of Canaan by the Jordan. He is, however, afraid of meeting his brother Esau, wondering what his attitude will be after those 20 years. So he sends messengers ahead to tell Esau he's coming. And his fears seem to be confirmed when they return and tell him that Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men. So he splits his flocks and herds into two and prays to God for protection. And then he sends 5 herds ahead as gifts to protect Esau. He sends all his possessions across, his wives and children, all across the Jordan ahead of him. And he then spends the night alone. And that's when a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now this, of course, was God, as Jacob realized, because at the end he says, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." And the interesting bit here is Jacob won't let go of God now until God blesses him. So although his commitment in the first encounter seemed to be a bit half-hearted, he's obviously pretty determined this time. So God says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." And he blesses him. So this encounter, this experience, not only changes his name, but his attitude changes. And when he meets Esau, he bows down to the ground 7 times and addresses him as "my lord." Esau has also changed, however, And rather than wanting to kill Jacob, he ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms round his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So Jacob's prayers for protection and blessing are answered, and the relationship between the brothers is restored, at least on the surface. It doesn't all go that well. Jacob tells God to go back to Bethel, where he had the dream of the ladder, settle there and build an altar to him. That's possibly a little prompt for Jacob to fulfill his vow. So Jacob purifies his household of all foreign gods. Presumably that would be those his wives and the servants he'd acquired in the east had with them, and offers sacrifices to God. God appears to him yet again, blesses him, confirms his change of name, and renews the promise that a nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will come from your body. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. After this, Rachel gives birth to Benjamin, completing the 12 sons of Israel, who will become the promised nation, the 12 tribes. So Israel's story continues, and the next installment will be the story of Joseph and his brothers, but that's going to be for another time. So as you'll expect, I do have a couple of questions we can discuss. Jacob recognized everything that comes from God and wanted to freely give him a tenth as thanks and praise for his provision. How generous and cheerful are we in our giving to God? And you might like to look at 2 Corinthians 9:7. Secondly, Jacob wrestled with God all night and would not let him go until he blessed him. How often do we really struggle in prayer with God until we see an answer?